What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Pioneer video, and Slickshot Show Off is easily one of the most hype cards from Outlaws of Thunder Junction and has been the card from Outlaws of Thunder Junction that I think has performed, above even that expectation, where we knew it was going to be a super aggressive card going into the format. We knew that it was going to slot into a few decks, and we'll kind of see how it ends up working out. There's been plenty of cards throughout previous season that I think they slot perfectly into some of the more established decks in the format, and then end up, not really being, too much of a player in those decks. And I think Slickshot Show Off is definitely a key piece in a few of the different aggro decks kind of based around Slickshot Show Off and trying to use its powerful ability. So today we're going to be doing kind of a beginner's guide on the few different flavors of Slickshot Show Off aggro, and just kind of get you in the mindset of, if you decide to play this version of this deck, this is kind of the things you're looking for. Because even though Slickshot Show Off is kind of the thing that connects all these decks together, there are a few different reasons to play the different versions and some different play styles and choices that you're going to have to make depending on what version you pick up. So today I'm going to kind of help you make that decision, and hopefully make that decision a lot easier and kind of give you a head start when you start playtesting a deck and learning it for your RCQ season. But of course, before we get too deep into the decks, we get too deep into the guide, if you're already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos like this, I post a lot of modern and Pioneer content along with some other longer form videos. So if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing to the channel and ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. Be sure to check out the podcast, the Casual Spikes podcast, that goes up on most Saturdays. I'm hoping I don't work this weekend, partially so I can get an episode out, but if not, we'll try to get one out Saturday or Sunday. So that's it for the intro. Let's go ahead and kind of we're going to make this easy. We're going to break it down. We're going to look at Mono Red first, and we have Gruul and Boros, and we'll kind of just go through and really decipher, what exactly is going on with these decks. Because again, even though, Slickshot Show Off is kind of the bridge to all these decks and kind of what makes them similar in nature, obviously there's probably some other overlap in cards, but in general, they're trying to abuse the power of Slickshot Show Off. So let's go ahead and we'll get into our first deck. So here we have the mono red version of Slickshot Show Off aggro. While it's not seemingly doing all that well in the Pioneer challenges, I know that Todd Anderson, however you refer to him as, I saw that he went to an RCQ with mono red aggro and just absolutely crushed with it. I think the deck is very swingy, where I think if you are having some very good draws, you're just going to kind of wipe the floor with people. And then if you have some middling draws, you could still potentially win games, but I think it definitely gets a lot harder, because this deck is kind of this super all-in aggro deck. I say that it's pretty easy to pilot because a lot of your spells and things like that, and kind of the power of Show Off and some of these prowess creatures, are playing your spells pre-combat or in combat to kind of eke out as much damage as possible. So the namesake card, of course, in all of these decks is going to be Slickshot Show Off. I'll show it here and won't really bother showing it, just kind of all the things that synergize with it. But Slickshot Show Off is a 2-mana 1/2 bird wizard with flying and haste. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Slickshot Show Off gets +2/+0 until end of turn, and you can plot it for 2 mana. The plot here is not so much as relevant as with Boros and Gruul, just because, again, the different flavors of those decks, which we'll get into when we get to those decks. But with Slickshot Show Off definitely being a 2-mana creature that is going to come into play, it's going to have haste, it's going to immediately be able to get in for a point of damage, or at least attempt to get in for a point of damage, and then the turn you get to untap with it, you're going to go absolutely nuts. Of course, there is some playing around, damage spells and everything like that. The problem is with mono red, you don't really have that kind of protection stuff. Some of the other colors, they have protection on top of some different kind of pump spells and things like that. Mono red, you're essentially into the burn strategy. So with Slickshot Show Off is a wizard, Slow Scar Mage, wizard, Get to Lava Runner is a wizard, Monastery Swift Spear, a monk, unfortunately not a wizard, because it doesn't help us really that much with some of the other cards we have going on. So the idea of this deck, you play something like Get to Lava Runner or Soul Scar Mage, Swift Spear on turn 1. You play Slickshot Show Off on turn 2. Sometimes you even play this Kamado, which ends up putting in a lot of work and is probably one of the best cards across some of these Slickshot decks. So the idea is ideally You can play Kamano on turn 1, deal damage to your opponent and each planeswalker they control, whatever. You play a Slickshot Show Off. It comes down and it's immediately a 2/3, and it's going to get in, an extra point of damage on top of the point of damage it's going to get in because it has haste. So you have a 2/3. You kind of play a little bit better against stuff like Play with Fire. Your opponent can't stack Spikefield Hazards or things like that. They're going to have to go all the way up to Skewer the Critics, Wizard's Lightning, if you're playing against Mono Red and stuff. Again, you're not going to be able to beat things like Fatal Push. You're not going to be able to beat things like Triumph, whatever, Go for the Throat, things like that with Mono Red. However, you can kind of mitigate some of the other damage spells. So, going turn 1 Kamano, turn 2 Slickshot Show Off. Turn 3, you untap with all your mana. If you're able to, we'll just keep it simple. You're able to, triple Wizard's Lightning your opponent. That's 9 damage from Wizard's Lightning. That's another 6 damage from the Slickshot Show Off. It already has 2 power, so that's 8. 8 plus 9, you have 17, and then 2 from Kamano is 19 damage on turn 3. I believe it gets to be more if you just have Monstrous Rage, because then you can kind of, Rage the Show Off and then Rage the Kamano, and then, whatever, Wizard's Lightning, Spikefield Hazard, whatever. At that point, probably really doesn't matter because you're going to be dealing a ton of damage, and it's trampling damage as well, so your opponent can't really chump block, your flyer or even your ground creature all that well. As well. So definitely interesting. Again, there's a lot of burn here. We have Wizard's Lightning, Skewer the Critics. You essentially have 8 virtually 1 mana, 3 damage burn spells. They're 3 mana initially without any kind of help, but if you control Wizard's Lightning, it's a 1 mana, deal 3, and Skewer the Critics, if you've dealt damage or if an opponent has lost life this turn, it deals 3 damage, so you can kind of stack it with Spikefield Hazard, ding your opponent, and then you can Spectacle Skewer the Critics as well. Light up the stage. For 3 mana, you get to do this effect, but of course, just like Skewer the Critics, if your opponent has lost life, more than likely if you've dealt damage to them, you're going to be able to play this for 1 mana, exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you can play those cards. So you not only get that turn to play those cards that you reveal them, but you also get the next turn as well, which, unless you reveal 2 lands, you're going to be able to play both spells that are come off the Light Up the Stage. The mana base is super simple. Obviously just play mono red. You have 4 Den of the Bugbear, 4 Ramunap Ruins, which can kind of give you that little bit of reach. I think a lot of the time decks like this struggle against heavy removal decks. We have the Rakdos Vampires of the format, where if they just have a hand that's just full of Bitter Triumph and Fatal Pushes and things like that, and they have Vein Ripper and stuff, it's very hard to win games like that. And Rakdos certainly does have draws like that. However, if they just try to play kind of this fair-ish creature, Tapland on 1, Bloodtithe Harvester on 2, there is ways to kind of play around that. Again, Bloodtithe Harvester on 2, they need a Bloodtithe Harvester on 3 to kill a Slickshot that already has a counter from Kamano, and even then, that's kind of fine with you because they wasted their turn 3 doing the Slickshot, because you do have other copies of Slickshot plus other hasty prowess creatures as well that are going to get buffed from casting all these spells. You have a Soken Zen, which is going to make some 1/1s as well. Just good to have one of these as a utility land if you need it. And 10 Mountains, super simple. Your sideboard, you have End of the Festivities, deal 1 damage each opponent, each creature, planeswalker they control. Red Cap Melee is just good removal for red creatures. This kind of sucks if you bring this in against anybody else, because if you deal damage to a non-red permanent, you have to sacrifice a land. But in matchups like this, just getting to deal 4 damage is super clean and easy. Rending Volley, this is, I believe, for Amalia more than anything here lately, for the fact of it's uncounterable, can't be countered by spells or abilities, and Rending Volley deals 4 damage to target white or blue creature. Amalia notably is white, so you are able to Rending Volley to get rid of her and not have to pay the ward cost as well. Roiling Vortex is another way to stop your opponents from gaining life. In the off chance that your opponent casts a spell and no mana was spent to cast that spell, it deals 5 damage to that player. So this is kind of a way that you can tech against Quintorius combo, where they're kind of trying to go, they can't really go off in the face of a Roiling Vortex, because they're just going to get dealt a lot more damage. I believe you're going to be able to outrace them, and as long as you've dealt them a little bit of damage beforehand, Roiling Vortex should outrace the amount of life that they can gain from playing and copying Quintorius's and things like that. You have Scorching Shot, which is a new card from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. It's just 2 mana, deal 5 to a creature. Straight up, you're in mono red, you don't have any Ramunap Ruins, I guess, technically taps for colorless, but, you have everything produces red mana, so just having another, deal 5 damage is something that's really nice. Tears of Valka can't be countered by spells or abilities. Just deal 5 damage to target creature with flying. This is definitely a decent Vein Ripper answer. It gets a little worse when your opponent is able to put a counter on it from their Sorin. But Tears of the Valka, like the turn that a whatever comes down, you are able to just kill it. You don't have to sacrifice a creature. You just end up getting it out of the way. You get to pump your prowess and Slickshot show off, and then just absolutely get in for a ton of damage. Case of the Crimson Pulse, a pretty good card for kind of like these more mid-range matchups where you get to discard a card and then draw 2 cards, so you can kind of like pitch additional lands to hopefully draw 2 spells. And when you eventually get empty-handed, which you will playing this deck pretty often, you're going to be in top deck mode pretty early. You can then solve the case, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, you discard your hand, draw 2 cards, and then you'll end up drawing a card for your draw step. So you'll essentially get access to 3 cards. You're going to upgrade your draw step from 1 to 3 cards, and then just have the ability to try to play all of them. Of course, you're not going to be able to carry any of those cards into the next turn, but when you're at the point where you're casting the Case of the Crimson Pulse, more than likely you're going to end up possibly drawing a land, and then even if you draw one of these 3 mana spells, you're getting to play 2 out of the 3 cards that you drew, which I would say is pretty decent. Goblin Chain Whirler, former standard all-star, making its way back into the deck. 3/3 first strike for 3 red mana is pretty good, on top of the fact that it deals 1 damage to each opponent and each creature they control. So this is like a way that you can enable the Spectacle on Skewer the Critics and light up the stage. Again, not a wizard, just a warrior, but when you're trying to be pretty aggressive, that things work out pretty well. Kari's Expertise is going to be you can just take a creature or a vehicle, untap it, and gain haste, and then you can play a card with mana value 2 or less from your hand. You have a decent amount of 2 mana value or less creature or cards. Kari's Expertise too. You could just go and take someone's Vein Ripper. You get to pump all your things. You get to attack for a ton of damage and more than likely kill your opponent. Rampaging Frostodon, another card, 3 mana, 3/3. Players can't gain life. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, Rampaging Frostodon deals 1 damage to that creature's controller. Chances are by the time you get up to 3, you're not playing any other creatures. You're just playing a bunch of spells. Your Amalia opponent's not going to be able to really gain life. They're not going to be able to, gain life, and then they're taking damage whenever they play a creature, so then they have to figure out a way to get rid of the Rampaging Ferocidon. And Witchstalker Frenzy, which seems to be going down more and more, as this just deals 5 damage to target creature, but it costs 1 less to cast for each creature that attack this turn. So you are able to go into the combat step, attack, and then before your opponent's able to declare blocks, cast a Witchstalker Frenzy to kill whatever creature that you want to kill, mainly kind of a shielded remover. So that's the mono red version of this deck. So we talked about this being kind of the easier version of the deck. So with the mono red version, there's not really any play to the deck in the sense that you're not going to be able to leave up mana to protect Slickshot Show Off. In the few corner cases where you can play a Kamano on 1, Slickshot Show Off on 2, or even any one of these other 1/2s essentially on turn 1 or on turn 2, you're not going to be able to beat a Fatal Push. You're not going to be able to beat Bitter Triumph, Go for the Throat, or Leyline Binding and things like that. Some of the damage-based removal you can, with like Soul Scar Mage, Swift Spirit, get 2 Lava Runner. You play them with a Kamano, they become 2/3s immediately, and then if your opponent plays like a Wizard's Lightning, Skewer the Critics, whatever, you can end up playing like a Play with Fire. Monstrous Rage, in a way, also kind of helps you like boost past it because it gives you the Monster Rule token, which will give it +1/+1 and trample permanently until another roll token, I guess, gets assigned to it, which I had no idea that's how that worked. Never came up where I wanted to put 2 on a creature, but if you try to target the creature with the same one, it's essentially just +2/+0, and then you get rid of your monster roll token and create a new one. Do with that information what you will. But so you can kind of have these protected against like damage-based removal and like combat-based damage and things like that. But aside from that, that's really it. And with Rakdos being one of the more popular decks where they have kind of all that hard removal, it's not going to end very well. And of course Amalia, same thing, which this deck actually is an interesting way of trying to knot up the score with our Amalia. But your essentially kind of all in on this aggro play. And you're playing like a Lava Runner, Soulscar Mage, Swift Spear on turn 1, Slickshot on turn 2, or going Kamano into, multiple of these on like turn 2. And then turn 3, you're just blasting your opponent with Wizard's Lightning, Skewer the Critics, using Light Up the Stage to kind of get that card advantage going so you can play more of your burn to kind of get your opponent down to a lower life total. Monstrous Rage as well ends up kind of getting you to the finish line. Again, like if your opponent tries to like block on the ground and try to soak up damage, not only is Monstrous Rage going to make sure that your creature, survives the combat and you're able to continue to do damage, but it's also going to give it, permanently +1/+1 and trample. It's going to then also get in damage in front of that creature as well initially on that turn. And of course, just make other spells kind of more lethal. Again, when you have like a Soulscar Mage, it's like a 2/3 just naturally, especially in like the mirror, your opponent is like, the onus is on them to then play a spell to kind of pump their prowess creatures in combat, to which then like they only bounce off of each other. And then if you just play a spell, you're back to, killing them or killing their creature and then dealing them damage. So the mono red version, as you can tell, definitely more all in, definitely more streamlined. You're not really going to be super punished, I would say, in a way where, if your opponent just stumbles, like this deck can just kill them out of nowhere. Like turn 2 Slickshot, your opponent's on, 1 mana, they pass a turn, and you're just untapping with like your 3rd land, and then you just have things like, Skewer the Critics, Wizard's Lightning, even like Light Up the Stage as well. You're going to be able to get 3 additional points of damage thanks to, prowess plus the, ability of Slickshot Show Off, and just absolutely run your opponent over. And there's just a ton of draws, even like having played this deck a little bit, where again you can just kind of curve where you go, creature on 1, creature on 2, and then you just go like attack with attack with like Soulscar Mage, attack with like Slickshot Show Off, Wizard's Lightning you, play with fire you. That's 8 points of burn. You have 9 total damage added from just counting the spells. So I mean, like you have 17 there, and then you have the 2 power from these, so like 19 damage on like turn 3. This deck just can kind of win the game out of nowhere. And of course, that just means your opponent taps a Mana Confluence, they're dead. They shocked a land into play, they're dead. What have you? So definitely, not only that, if they somehow are at 1 life or whatever, like everything else in this deck kills them. Spikefield Hazard, Kamano, the other copies of Skewer the Critics, Wizard's Lightning, so on. So, so that's the mono red version of the deck. Pretty straightforward, pretty streamlined. This, I would say, to me at least, is like the worst, but is definitely the one that is the easiest to pick up. And I think kind of the most straightforward kind of build of the deck. And just because it's easy doesn't mean that it's necessarily not that good. Just personally for me, I would rather play one of the other 2 options instead of this one, but I think it's worth pointing out because this is kind of where it started, and where Slickshot Show Off is definitely like your best creature in this deck, hands down, just because it enables so much of what else is going on in the deck. So if you're really good at drawing Slickshot Show Offs, hopefully not by cheating purposes, then this deck is great, because having just 1 Slickshot is amazing. Having 2 is absolutely bonkers. So if you're really good at drawing them, and again, this is kind of like the centerpiece of the deck, mono red might be for you, because then you're able to just kind of like cheese a ton of wins just by, again, playing multiple Slickshots and then playing a bunch of burn spells and stuff like that. So that is the mono red version of the Slickshot Show Off deck. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other variants that I personally enjoy playing and have enjoyed playing over the last few days. So here we have Gruul Slickshot. So we're playing like green-red. And this deck, some of the same things. We have Swift Spear, Soulscar Mage, and Slickshot Show Off as some of our creatures. Obviously, you'll see that Get 2 Lava Runner is missing because it is replaced with a Questing Druid. Questing Druid has this neat little, neat little adventure spell. Oh, can we say that 5 times fast? So Seek the Beast is like the adventure spell. It's an instant, so it plays kind of the same role that something like a Light Up the Stage does. But for instant speed, 2 mana, you exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until your next end step, you may play those cards. So not ideal to play this on turn 2 on your turn, because you've played a land, so you're not going to be able to play a land from it, and you're not going to really be able to play a spell. You're going to end up playing, playing your second land, passing, and then playing this like on your end step, or on their end step, excuse me. So then when you go to your turn, you have the ability to play lands from it, and then be able to cast spells as well. On top of that, too, Questing Druid itself isn't too bad as a 2 mana 1/1, that whenever you cast a spell that's not green, or it has any one of the other colors. I shouldn't say not green. But whenever you cast a spell that's white, blue, black, or red, you put a +1/+1 counter on Questing Druid. So this is kind of like a card that, is like a theme for a lot of these Slickshot decks, is that a lot of these creatures like don't care what is getting targeted necessarily with like pump spells or any other like, things that are happening. They just naturally get bigger. So, we know with like Slickshot Show Off, Questing Druid, Soulscar Mage, and Swift Spear, thanks to prowess on, Swift Spear and Soulscar Mage, from its ability on Questing Druid and from its ability on Slickshot Show Off. If we're targeting our opponents with, like Play with Fires and like casting like Witchstalker, Frenzy, Audacity, and things like that, these creatures are just automatically going to get bigger. I guess Questing Druid, not really in the case of Audacity, but you get the picture. Like, you don't care. Like, Slickshot Show Off doesn't care if you target Questing Druid with Monstrous Rage, because it's still going to get buffed by its ability. And same thing with these prowess creatures. And then, of course, like, around like the horn and everything like that. So as you can kind of notice, this deck is definitely less burn focused. We're not playing Wizard's Lightning. We're not playing the, Skewer the Critics and things like that. Instead, opting for things like Play with Fire and like a Targus Command as your burn spells. So like a Targus Command is really powerful. I mean, you being able to give your creatures +1/+1 and reach until end of turn and dealing 3 damage to each opponent. Some of the other modes are pretty good. Like, your opponents can't gain life this turn. That's a way that you can mess with like Amalia, which is easily one of your worst matchups. Putting a land from your hand onto the battlefield really isn't that impactful, I would say. But I guess if you want to play like two drops on turn 3, you could deal 3 to your opponent and then put a land from your hand on the battlefield if you're kind of flooding especially hard. But to maximize the amount of damage, you're giving your creatures +1/+1 and then dealing 3 damage with this. And again, with prowess and Questing Druid's ability, Slickshot Show Off's ability, you are just dealing tons of damage with the Targus Command. Even with like 2 of these in play, if you have like 2 prowess creatures in play, they're you attack for with 2 1/2s. Then you cast Targus Command. They're 2 3s. They're 3 4s from the pump, and then your opponent's dealt 3 damage. That's 9 damage, with just Soulscar Mage, Swift Spear, and a Targus Command, which is a ton of damage. And if you just stack them up with things like Monstrous Rage, again, kind of making its appearance, giving your creature trample, pretty good, I've heard. Audacity is in the same boat, where it's going to give your creature +2/+0 and trample permanently, and then whenever it's put in the graveyard from the battlefield, you get to draw a card, so it eventually replaces itself. Kamado, again, kind of showing up. Demonic Ruckus is a new card from the Outlaws of Thunder Junction set, which I've been moderately impressed with. There's been times where it has been pretty good, other times where it's been pretty mediocre. It has like kind of the same, bill, I guess, as like Audacity, where if it goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, you get to draw a card. You can plot it for 1 mana, which I think in this deck, kind of whatever, at least to me, for the most part. I mean, there's like some synergy with getting to like play Slickshot Show Off or any one of these other things, and then put a Demonic Ruckus on it to where you're able to kind of chip in for a ton of damage right away. But with Ruckus in particular, with like Slickshot Show Off, it's going to give your creature +1/+1, give it Menace and Trample permanently, which is going to make, like, for your ground creatures, having Menace is going to be pretty good, because your opponent's going to have multiple creatures. Menace in the air too is virtually unblockable, and if your opponent is able to get enough creatures to block in front of any one of these, they're going to need 2 of them. And again, you have like Monstrous Rage, Plays with Fires, Targus Command, so on. It's going to be pretty hard for them to be able to put enough damage in front of one of these creatures. And even if they do, you've kind of traded like 2 cards for like 2 or 3 of their creatures. And if not, I mean, you again have like a huge pumped up creature that's getting in for a ton of damage, and they're losing their board trying to block it. Look at the mana base and stuff like that. You have Boseiju. You're playing 20 lands too, which is the same amount that you're playing in like the mono red version. Your Capillary Gorge, Crag Crown Pathway. You're playing 2 Den of the Bugbear instead of 4 from the mono red version. You have a Ramen Up Ruins that you can just kind of go, and again, it'll just end up dealing hopefully the last 2 points of damage if you end up drawing it. Soken Zen, just another one of, and 4 Stomping Grounds in this deck. And something I didn't mention earlier, the other, like the mono red versions are super cheap, like just over $150 in paper. This deck just over $300, like just under $300, which really for Pioneer decks, and with how good I think some of these other like 2-color Slickshot version deck, Slickshot aggro decks are. It's pretty good. I mean, you get a Boseiju in there as well, and Boseiju is kind of like a sought after card. Stomping Ground's a pretty good card to have. Play with Fires have seen like a ton of play. Slickshot Show Off, if you end up playing any of the aggro decks, are pretty good. Things like that. Sideboard, you're looking at Alpine Moon, 4 Pick Your Poison, Rending Volley, Magebane Lizard, and Rampaging Ferocidon. A little bit simpler of a sideboard. Alpine Moon, getting to mess with the Lotus Field decks. You have Pick Your Poison is like a way that you can get around the ward cost of the Vampire. Vein Ripper, Rending Volley, same thing. You can just target this with Amalia and get around the ward cost. Magebane Lizard against the Phoenix decks. Magebane Lizard just ends up progressively dealing more and more damage to them the more they try to go off. So this is going to demand an answer, which means they're not dealing with necessarily dealing with like Slickshot Show Off and things like that, or at least makes it a little bit harder. It's a layer of protection, if you will. Rampaging Ferocidon also can't gain life, deal 1 damage to each creature. So that's essentially the Gruul Slickshot deck. And so now I talked about this deck being, I guess these other versions being different from mono red, and that's because they play defense a little bit better. And by playing defense, I mean like really just playing like defending kind of these threats and stuff. So, we have a little bit more of like the toughness pump spells. We have like a Targus Command, and I guess technically 2 with Druid, Mage, and Swift Spear. They're all going to get their toughness buffed by casting some of these red spells. But the one in particular that I neglected to mention is Blossoming Defense. So for 1 green, you can give a creature +2/+2 and it gains hexproof until end of turn. A little bit worse because, there is some ways, and I think people kind of like struggle with, like they don't want to necessarily like take damage. And a lot of the times they'll play their removal spells like pre-combat, which kind of plays into what these Slickshot decks want to be doing. So if you play like pre-combat, they attack and they're hitting you for like 8, and you're like, okay, I'm going to Fatal Push or Slickshot Show Off. They play Blossoming Defense. They're going to get, 3 to 4, power worth of pump just from casting the spell. And then they're going to get +2/+2 and counter your spell. So you're going to end up taking another 6 damage. You're going to take 14. You're either dead or near death, and you have 2 or 3 creatures that are all potentially lethal, depending on like what your opponent's hand is made up of. Even then, if that taps you out, they could then just like end up playing another spell and just straight up killing you. So a lesson that I will kind of put in here because I think it's a little bit more applicable now than it was with the mono red version. Honestly, if your opponent's content with only dealing 6-8 damage and then passing the turn, you definitely then want to be able to interact with your opponent with like Fatal Push, Bitter Triumph, go for the throw, Leyline Binding, and things like that. Because if you get caught into a point where your opponent's able to then play a protection spell, they're going to counter your spell again and deal just a ton of damage to you. And, it kind of just negate the purpose. Like you go from like your opponent's like, I don't think I should go for it. I'm just going to attack, get in my damage, to where you're like, okay, I'm going to tap out to deal with your threat. And then like, okay, well, I can just kill you while also protecting like my big threat. So definitely things to keep in mind when playing against the different Slickshot variants. Mono red, that's not really going to come up too much, but in Gruul and Boros especially, you can get blown out just by trying to interact with their things pre-combat and in the combat step before damage has actually been dealt. Because again, things kind of get awkward, and it looks pretty bad when you get Blossoming Defense and some of the other things that we have in like the Boros build. So yeah, this deck definitely has a little bit more staying power. I think it's a little bit more aggressive, or maybe not a little more aggressive. It definitely is fine-ish playing a longer game. So the fact of the matter that you can just kind of play like Demonic Ruckus, you have Audacities and things like that, and you strap them to some of these like prowess creatures, even like a Questing Druid with just like a Demonic Ruckus on it. I mean, it's going to be a 3/3, 3/3 Menace Trample. And, as you kind of cast like Play with Fires, Monstrous Rages, Atarkus Commands, whatever, this is just going to get bigger, and it's going to be even harder to block, not only by its size, not only from the keywords and stuff, but from its size as well. So, these cards can make any one of these creatures just uber lethal. Even the turn that you cast like an Audacity on like a Swift Spear or a Soulscar Mage, it ends up being a 3/3 that's attacking, and chances are you have something like Monstrous Rage, Play with Fire, so that you can end up making it like a 4/4 as well, which is pretty hard for a lot of decks to interact with on like the early turns of the game. So definitely to keep in mind, like while Gruul I would say is, can be a deck that can win the game pretty quick. All these Slickshot variants can win the game pretty quickly. But when it comes to playing a slightly longer game, I think this deck is pretty okay with that, for the fact that, some of your enchantments and stuff make your creatures very good. And if they, end up leaving the battlefield, whatever, you're going to be able to replace them by getting to draw a card from their effect. You have a Target's Command to end up dealing a ton of damage. You got a little bit of burn between a Target's Command, Play with Fire. That really, if you can just get in, one or two good hits with some of these prowess creatures, or one hit with Slickshot Show Off, chances are you're going to be able to burn them out of the game. If the game goes long, you even have some of this card advantage going with Questing Druid, where if your opponent's playing counter spells, they have to decide okay, do they want you to potentially have 2 additional spells, or look at 3 cards, or do they want to counter this, which of course then opens them up to a plotted Slickshot Show Off to then come down, cast a bunch of spells, and kill them. So it's definitely some more decisions that kind of go into this deck, where we talked about how in the mono red deck, plotting Slickshot Show Off, really wasn't that applicable. There's times where you could do it, but in reality, it didn't really matter if you did or not. You'd really want to play it on turn 2. This deck, you can just plot this and then be able to leave up Blossoming Defense for the rest of the game and force your opponent to have multiple removal spells to deal with Slickshot Show Off. And if they're having to spend multiple spells on Slickshot Show Off to get rid of it, then that means these prowess creatures are just going to be able to kind of run rampant. And, again, as you try to protect Slickshot Show Off from some of that removal and things like that, they're going down on resources. They're going to need more resources to deal with these things, and you're just going to be able to push through a ton of damage. So that is the Gruul version of Slickshot Show Off. We have one more to show off, and no pun intended. We have one more version of the Slickshot deck to kind of show off, and it's the version that I've been playing, the one I'm the happiest with, and the one that I think kind of utilizes, I guess, kind of plays more into the pump spell aspect of the deck. And I think the version that people really thought that Slickshot would kind of slot into the best. So let's go ahead and check out our final deck of the video. So I had to go to a Moxfield for this because this is a list I've been playing. This is a Doomwake's list that he played in one of his videos, and I was... I definitely think there's some changes that could be made to the deck, but I've been pretty happy with just how this build has performed for me playing in the Pioneer qualifier event for Mana Traders and stuff. So to kind of recap a little bit of what we've looked at. So we've looked at a more Wizards focused build in mono red, where you're playing Get 2 Lava Runner and you're still playing the prowess creatures. We've saw the Gruul version, where instead of playing something like Get 2 Lava Runner, you're playing Questing Druid to kind of give you a little bit of card advantage, but also giving you an additional threat with some protection spells as well, but still kind of into playing the burn spells and things like that. This version, the Boros, essentially the Boros Heroic Shell, just slotting in Slickshot Show Off, and kind of making some other tweaks to the deck, is definitely one of the versions I've been very happy with. So as far as the creatures, kind of the draw to it, where Slickshot Show Off was easily probably your best creature and the creature that was going to deal the most damage, it actually kind of plays, at least to me, second fiddle to something like Illuminator Virtuoso. So for those of you that may not know what this card is, it's a 2-mana 1/1 double strike, but when it becomes the target of a spell you control, it connives. So you get to draw a card and then discard a card. If you discard a non-land card, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and this gets out of hand super quickly. We talked about draws of mono red and a little bit in Gruul, where you can kind of get Slickshot Show Off up to a 6, 7, 8 power creature, pretty early on, on turn 3. Illuminator Virtuoso, if you get to untap with this creature and, you end up hitting your third land, which, if you're me playing this deck, you always hit your third land with this deck until you don't. You just pile up cards like Monstrous Rage, Defiant Strike, and not Reckless Rage, Ancestral Anger. So you have Ancestral Anger and Defiant Strike, which are all going to draw cards. So you're able to target Virtuoso, draw a discard, put a counter on this, and then Ancestral Anchor, Defiant Strike is going to, give it +1/+0, or Ancestral Anchor is going to give it more and Trample, and then you're going to get to draw a card. So you're kind of able to keep the card advantage going. Homestead Courage is going to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and it's going to gain Vigilance, and it flashes back for a white as well. So this is a card that you could kind of freely discard to a Illuminator Virtuoso and still have a spell to cast. Giving it Vigilance and Trample is absolutely busted, because it's definitely not out of the question to get this card up to a 6, 7, 8 power, even more on turn 3. and just one-shot your opponent. And again, if you don't one-shot your opponent, they're virtually dead. Same with the other versions of Slickshot aggro. You kind of want to plot Slickshot Show Off a little bit more than you want to cast it. Of course, it depends on like the decks you're playing. If you're not really worried about removal, then just playing this to get in your point is fine. Plotting this in like turn 2 and then like kind of having like the same turns where you have like Illuminator Virtuoso, where like I think Illuminator you want to play it on turn 2 because you want to try to kill your opponent on turn 3. But if like you're threat light, then it's kind of correct to hold them to be able to Lauren's Escape or God's Willing them to kind of, you know, give it hexproof indestructible with Lauren's Escape, and you get to scry God's Willing protection from a color of your choice until end of turn. You get to scry as well. You know, holding these threats and being able to leave up, you know, these protection spells are pretty good because just like being able to like Blossoming Defense, it's kind of like a blowout to your opponent. And in some cases, like Illuminator Virtuoso, like you get to add 2 damage. So, you know, in this case in particular, you kind of get to do the same thing with like Blossoming Defense. Just you also get a scry on top of it as well. But yeah, this deck also playing Demonic Ruckus, which pairs a little bit better with Illuminator Virtuoso because you can't play this on turn 2 after you've plotted this on turn 1, and then like you have the potential to make this a 3/3. Again, doesn't really protect it against like the hard removal and stuff like that. But the fact that like, you have a 3/3 and you're untapping kind of with like all your mana, you could even like have a turn where like you wait until turn 3, you play your 3rd land, play Illuminator, Demonic Ruckus to, you know, target this, and then you're able to leave up like Lauren's Escape, God's Willing, and force your opponent to again have like multiple spells for this Virtuoso. Definitely a little bit more blowout potential. You know, we have a card like Favorite Hoplite is kind of like the other 1-drop in the deck, where it gets a +1/+1 counter if you target it and you prevent all damage that would be dealt to it this turn. Plays really well with things like Reckless Rage, where you can deal 4 damage to a creature you don't control and 2 damage to a creature you control. Favorite Hoplite's just going to shrug it off. Monastery Swift Spear doesn't really care. Virtuoso and Slickshot Show Off a little bit more. You'll need a lot more help to kind of like get these guys going for a Reckless Rage, but nonetheless, it's still, you know, triggers Slickshot Show Off, targets the Illuminator Virtuoso, so you are able to kind of connive out of it as well. So definitely a deck that is more in on the pump spells, which can be a good or a bad thing. You know, the burn spells are always going to be pretty good, but like the pump spells and stuff like that, and the explosive ability of like Illuminator Virtuoso just to end the game on its own, where Slickshot Show Off isn't also necessarily the primary target either. I mean, it is another 2-drop that can just come down and win the game pretty early, but you don't necessarily need to focus your game plan on Slickshot Show Off. Like, this is not your best creature in the deck. Illuminator Virtuoso is absolutely your best creature in the deck, and I will not take any slander at all whatsoever. Because a lot of the spells that you want to be playing on Slickshot Show Off, you're going to be able to play on Virtuoso, and it's just going to end up dealing, you know, essentially twice the damage thanks to Double Strike. The mana base as well ends up being pretty sweet. It would be a lot cheaper. I mean, you use 327 like here on the bottom. It would be a lot cheaper if you didn't have like this 1 mana confluence. I guess you could play another pathway. I found the pathways to be super awkward, but like the damage also kind of adds up from mana confluence as well because you're also playing the battlefield forges. So definitely take it with a grain of salt. But I mean, 327 for this deck, and this would be the deck that I would play currently if I was going to play a build of Slickshot, just because, you know, this is pretty sweet. I would probably tweak some of the numbers. Maybe like 5 protection spells is like too much. You can probably go down to like a 3rd one, or cut like the God's Willing, leave like Lauren's Escape, because there is some draw potential with the Amalia decks and things like that. Sideboard, you have Light of Hope, more Reckless Rages, Rending Volleys, a Rest in Peace, Showdown of the Scalds, and a Sokenzen. This is kind of like a sort of mid-range package you can go into, and we've seen Showdown of the Skulls absolutely go off. Just getting to put counters on creatures you control, and I believe it's just spells like to target these guys, but you know, getting to put +1/+1 counters on them, get to look at 4 extra cards going into your next turn, you know, having 5 mana available to you is pretty nuts. Like, you can just end up dealing a ton of damage with this. And the Sokenzen just kind of makes it a little bit easier to cast it, because you'll go up to 21 lands between, you know, 19 in your mana base and then 2 from like your double face cards. Torpor Orb is also kind of an answer to the Amalia decks to kind of stop them from going off. And Amalia is like easily one of your worst matchups. Absolutely one of your worst matchups. And with kind of going into Boros and the Gruul versions, Rakdos is a little bit easier to handle. The Phoenix decks are a little bit easier to handle, just because like if they like dump their hand, if you're Phoenix, they dump their hand, they go off, they bring back like 2 birds or whatever. Like, yeah, it's pretty bad, and they could play defense and then get them back. Whatever, they could potentially mess with your creatures. But like if you ever get like a threat or 2 to stick, especially like a Virtuoso or a Slickshot show off, your opponent has to be very worried that they could just potentially die on nowhere, especially Illuminator, where if they tap out, bring back 2 birds, and like they don't kill your Virtuoso, which I don't think would actually happen, but if they just have like a bunch of cantrips and they're like, all right, well, here's my birds, go. You can just untap, and then you just end up like monstrous raging, discarding a card to Virtuoso to make it bigger, and then it ends up being, I believe it's 5 power already right there. Homestead Courage, bumps it up to at least 6, 7 if you discard a spell, and then even just like another monstrous rage, whatever, or like Defiant Strike, God's Willing, whatever. There's another 2 power, so that's like 18 damage right off the rip. So if you're, again, another situation where if your opponent shocks or they take damage from some of their other mana base or anything like that, they're going to end up dying to this Virtuoso just by kind of not respecting it. But that is Boros Slickshot. Again, this is probably the version that I would be more inclined to play over the Gruul. I like having the access to the protection spells. They play a little bit better on your turn, on your turn, your opponent's turn, than I think like Blossoming Defense does. Like the pump's fine, but just giving your creature indestructible, you're already going to kind of get that pump back from like Slickshot and Illuminator and things like that. So and I guess having Sujiri Shelter as well as like a 6th protection spell, I guess that you kind of want it, but I don't know. I've been kind of like meh on this card. It is one of, so take that for what you will. But yeah, like this deck, I would play the Boros version of the deck. The Gruul version I think is pretty good, but just not the version I would prefer. And then mono red, if you want like a budget option that can win games and play pretty well, then I think going with mono red is totally fine. Like it's definitely not a bad decision, but definitely if you have some of the things for Gruul or for the Boros versions, I would try to build into those versions. If you can build it for about the same price, you can build like the mono red version. So yeah, that is Slickshot Show Off. That's like our beginner's guide, or a little talk about the decks in general. Real quick recap, Slickshot Show Off and a lot of these decks are going to be your main threat. This is going to be the card that you're going to be looking to play at, like on turn 2 or plotting it on turn 2 in some of these cases, and just being able to protect it while also getting to deal massive amounts of damage, putting your opponent on a pretty quick clock, and really an undetectable kind of clock. I mean, they can just say like, okay, well, if he has 3 spells, then I'm not dead, or I am dead, and they end up playing in certain ways, which kind of can give you more time if you don't necessarily have the spells to close out the game to end up drawing those spells and eventually just win the game. And, and they're like, oh, like, of course they had it. And, you're just sitting there like, I didn't, but the fact that you played kind of scared. And that's maybe like even the big thing that this deck offers too, is it kind of like makes up certain opponents like play scared. Definitely I think even like the newer and intermediate like competitive players will definitely, if they've kind of played against this deck and got burned by it once, there's definitely that natural fear of like, I can just die out of nowhere, so I'm going to play pretty conservatively. And I don't think that's how you beat the Slickshot Show Off decks. I don't think you play, completely conservatively. I think you just have to be willing to take like calculated risks and kind of just like feel out the texture of the game and things like that. So yeah, that is the Slickshot Aggro variants of the Pioneer format. If you found this video helpful, you enjoyed it, anything like that, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what deck you would like to see kind of like a little beginner's guide done on next. Of course, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell so you know when future videos get posted. Check out the Casual Spikes podcast. We have a decent-sized playlist of some of the things going over the Modern and Pioneer formats and things like that, and going over some of the major like premium like events and stuff like RCs and the Pro Tour. So if any of that interests you, go ahead and check it out there as well. And yeah, that's going to do it for me this video. Hope you all enjoyed, and I hope to see you all in the next one.